Brian O Toole is with us today. He is has a long career in the sanctions world, in the world of sanctions. He is director of sanctions and screening in an important U.S. holding bank. But he is also a think tanker, since he is responsible for sanctions activities at the Atlantic Council. But he has also been working in the government in different positions, also in the U.S. Treasury, has been advisor to OFAC director. So he's a very good person with this very mixed background from the private to the academic intellectual activity to the governmental activity. So Brian, we would like to discuss a bit starting from the U.S. presidential elections. Mm-hmm. How is this issue of sanctions coming? Is it coming into the candidates' campaign? Do they use it in their way to try to get into the presidency? Is it an important political instrument or not in this campaign, as far as we saw until now?
It often becomes a topic of discussion if something goes wrong or if there's a particular incident that requires sanctions. But broadly speaking, sanctions themselves are not a kind of a presidential debate issue. So the way that they will come up in the presidential debate almost certainly will be around the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, around the Trump administration's efforts against Iran more broadly, and then probably also the Trump administration's foreign policies with respect to Russia, North Korea, and Venezuela, which have garnered quite a lot of criticism over the years by kind of both the left and the right here in the United States. But broadly speaking, it'll be discussions around the approach, say, to North Korea and their nuclear development program. Sanctions will be a part of that, but the big thrust will be whether Trump has delivered any real change in the status quo in North Korea, despite the beautiful letters he exchanges with Kim Jong-un, or whether the Trump administration's efforts in Venezuela have done more harm than good to people who were already suffering from a crisis created by the Maduro regime and Chavez preceding him. But that's how it kind of comes up in these presidential debates.
The humanitarian aspect of sanctions, maybe this is something that is included in the debate, probably.
A little bit, yeah. I think it sounds callous to say, and I don't mean it this way, but foreign policy generally doesn't seize Americans in presidential debates because the U.S. is so big and so complicated and has so many issues, as you've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement here, and all the debate recently over kind of the response to the COVID crisis and race relations and suppression of blacks in the U.S. So in the presidential world, humanitarian assistance may come up if there's a particular incident relating to Iran, right? If there's press reporting that the Trump sanctions have prevented Iran from getting needed humanitarian goods to combat COVID, that would be the type of thing that might come up. But it would take a specific incident, probably timed close to a debate, to really galvanize any attention for the issues that affect Americans more broadly, right? Unfortunately, Americans don't often see or understand kind of how some of the foreign policy issues impact them on a day-to-day basis. And it's tough to draw a line between, the technicalities of how humanitarian aid is or is not delivered to Iran and how that affects, somebody who's just in, rural Kansas or another part of the country that may not be as concerned with these issues.
Okay. Anyway, for good or for worse, but the presidency of Trump introduced some important shifts in sanction policy. The exiting JCPOA is, of course, the most relevant. But in general, there has been a sort of ideological change, I would say. Like abandoning the multilateralism. This is something very striking because the efficacy of sanctions has always been connected to a sort of multilateralism in this in sanctioning the targets. This is something that somehow has been seriously affected. And also this strong push in the concept of economic security, bringing so much of security into the economic domain. This is something also that can have long-time consequences, just when you perceive national security in an economic vision. Of course, this matches with the way that Mr. Trump is disengaging militarily from many parts of the world. So it looks like he wants to create a big toolbox of economic warfare, interconnecting not only sanctions and sanctions regimes, but also different tools, FDI screening, tariff and trade policies, and so on and so on. Is it something? It's so huge as a change to put this at the center of the foreign policy. Is something that is just a vision of Mr. Trump, or is a more deep ideological vision about it? And so something more structured that could survive also a shift in the presidency?
I think there are two different issues there. One is not necessarily a creature of Donald Trump, which is the kind of America first isolationist policies that he's pursued. And, you know, the way that that comes up in sanctions is, as you mentioned, the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, but also the approach against Iran more broadly, even against, you know, Venezuela and other countries. There has been this America first, which largely does translate to America alone. America has been isolated in a lot of ways from its European allies because of the policies of President Trump. And this administration doesn't seem to worry about or appreciate the value of multilateralism. They prefer a unilateral approach, and that's, you know, something that former National Security Advisor John Bolton certainly pushed for a long time when he was in office under President George W. Bush back in the early 2000s. And it's, you know, there's a strain of isolationism in the United States that's been around for, you know, hundreds of years. So I don't think that's anything new. I think they have applied it to sanctions, but only because sanctions are a tool of foreign policy, and that's the essential foreign policy. I think the one thing that they have done that's different in some ways from what past administrations have done is, as you talk about, kind of linking sanctions and trade policy and some of those issues that have historically been separated. And there are many good reasons to separate them. Trade policy is trade policy. It's not national security policy. Sanctions are national security policy. But more broadly, as a fundamental kind of trade basis as well, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, has kind of stayed out of the sanctions realm because the argument has been made for years and years that because sanctions are national security policy, the WTO has an exemption for those actions and has no business getting involved. I think some of the actions of the Trump administration, especially with respect to China, and this is something that's pushed by Peter Navarro, who's a longtime economic advisor to President Trump, you know, pulling all these things together could give the WTO some opening into going after whether sanctions are an unfair trade practice or not. And that's a dangerous place to be, because adverse rulings against the United States could then allow foreign countries to impose essentially counter sanctions that might have an impact on us. And it could call into question some of, not necessarily the legality, because the legality in the US is really what matters, but the kind of international acceptance of sanctions. And I think those norms, when you start violating the norms, sanctions do require some amount of buy-in from foreign jurisdictions, whether they're your partners, allies, or even adversaries to some degree. People have to understand and play by the rules. And if you call into question the legitimacy of your sanctions, it has an effect across all sanctions. It won't just be limited to, the U.S. acting rashly against Iran. It will have an impact on how people perceive U.S. actions in Venezuela and North Korea, and if we ever have to do it against China. And those are dangerous places to be for this administration that doesn't seem to worry too much or have a lot of care for those prior precedents and why they were important.
Okay, thanks. Just to finish this more presidential election part of our talk, the two main candidates, in which is the main sanction regimes that they are more, where there is a bigger gap, where they are more distant? Is it Iran? Is it Russia? Is it DPRK, or what is it?
Certainly Iran. The JCPOA is kind of the central issue on the Iran front, and there has been some indication from Biden's national security advisor for the campaign, former Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken, that there might be a move to rejoin the deal in some way, shape, or form. The details are a little unclear. That is certainly the biggest one. Honestly, the Russia sanctions are in a very weird place in the U.S. right now. I think there's a fair bit of stagnation, and I don't know that, despite Trump's obvious affinity for Vladimir Putin and his kind of undermining of the deterrent effect of sanctions, I don't know that at the end of the day, if you look at the actual impact and the sanctions on the books, that they're that much, they're certainly short of where a Biden administration would have gone over the last several years. But it's a little unclear about where things proceed forward. And the U.S. is still in a fairly adversarial stance with Russia, regardless of Trump. A lot of that's driven by Congress, and a lot of it's driven, frankly, by the people who work for Trump, who kind of corral him and won't let him go too far down the path of making nice with Putin. I think there's a potential for a more substantive change a difference on Cuba as well. You may recall during the Obama-Biden administration that there were efforts to push back on the Cuban embargo and roll it back. And so I don't believe the Biden campaign has made any sort of specific statement related to what their intentions are with Cuba. Certainly Cuba is a hotbed kind of political voting issue down in South Florida, and Florida is a swing state. It's a critical state in the United States election for president. But there may end up being some difference there as well if the Biden administration comes in and decides to push hard on either changing or rolling back the Cuban embargo, which has been in place since 1962.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so you mentioned Russia. This is from the European point of view, it's a very interesting topic. But we have seen some contradictory developments in this regime somehow, because it seems that it's somehow stalled or is in no man's land. We don't know where it can go. We saw some developments, but none was able to be effective. Most of these, after a couple of 2 or 3 years after the sanctions have been implemented, then Russia managed to get back on its economic track. Basically, also maybe they were also able to strengthen some parts of their economy, making it reducing some vulnerabilities, delinking it from the world of sanctions. So, do you agree? How do you judge this? This is a negative judgment on sanction, on the capacity of sanction to affect the will of Russia, because Russia didn't change, the Russia leadership didn't change its will, plus they didn't pay extraordinary economic price for it. So they challenged successfully the US sanctions, at least in the short term. How do you see this?
There's a lot to kind of unpack in the Russia debate and discussion. I do think that Russia has paid a fairly significant economic price from the sanctions imposed in 2014, and it continues to pay that price. It has trouble with capital expenditures and with getting, I mean, you can see the trouble they've had finishing Nord Stream 2, right? If sanctions weren't in place, Nord Stream 2 would have been finished a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So the sanctions do have an effect on an economic perspective, which kind of begs the question then of, well, what's the point of having an economic effect if you're not getting the change you want? And I think this is where the situation gets very complicated. Right? The sanctions imposed in 2014 against Russia were meant to essentially freeze the line of contact in Ukraine and forge a path to a political solution. The Minsk Accords provide that, although of course they have not been implemented in essentially any way, shape, or form by Moscow, which continues to deny that it has any role in the war in eastern Ukraine. So there's that piece of the sanctions, and one could certainly argue that the Trump administration has not pursued any policy with respect to Ukraine and its war vis-a-vis Russia, setting aside the other silly issues with Ukraine, and that has undermined the kind of purpose and effect of sanctions. Right, you impose the economic cost to try to get the Russians to pull out and to cease support and forge a political solution. That hasn't happened for a variety of reasons, not least of which is because I think Vladimir Putin judges rightly that he doesn't have to worry that President Trump will ratchet up the pressure on him to actually force implementation of Minsk. There has been no indication from President Trump that that's even on his radar or he cares at all. So there's that aspect. The other challenge with Russia is, especially in the early part of the Trump administration, the amount of aggressiveness by the Putin regime in Moscow increased substantially. Right, there was a war in Ukraine, there had been a stale war, a Cold War, a frozen conflict in Georgia since 2008 that the Obama administration had to deal with. And then in the waning months of the Obama administration, the politically charged issue of Russian interference in the election, the release of Hillary Clinton emails, John Podesta emails. Podesta was her campaign manager. And so the Obama administration, I think admitted that it reacted a little late to that. And there were reasons that happened, not least of which were consultations with Congress that did not go well in trying to hold Russia to account for its actions. But that issue spiked at the beginning of the Trump administration alongside use of chemical weapons in Syria, bombing of hospitals in Syria, targeted assassinations by Russians in Salisbury, England, and in other places in Europe, and a whole host of Russians also kind of mucked around with North Korea in a way that was counter to U.S. interests. So the Trump administration was confronting a whole series of kind of escalated Russian aggression, and took a few steps to impose sanctions in response to those, but there was never a coherent policy. And that has been the problem from the outset. Is Congress passed legislation, the Trump administration imposed sanctions, some of which actually had quite a lot of effect, especially the sanctions on Oleg Deripaska and Viktor Vekselberg. But the point of sanctions is to drive change of some sort, change in behavior. It might not be change in a regime, because that may not actually be a reasonable thing to expect in Russia or to even desire with the state of the opposition. I mean, it's plunging the country into chaos could be dangerous as well. And so the Trump administration has struggled with how do you impose kind of costs on Putin and try to deter Putin when you have a president who has no interest in doing it. And this is the same thing that Congress has struggled with as well. And so the Russia sanctions are kind of effectively stuck. There's not a lot of clarity on where we go from here. The Russian aggression has died down recently to some degree. They're still in Syria protecting the Assad regime, which is problematic. But the electoral interference, there may be some of it going on, but it doesn't seem as significant or as severe. And Putin's dealing with a host of problems at home. And if there's one thing we know about Vladimir Putin, he is an opportunist. And right now he does not have a lot of opportunity because he's busy defending turf at home. He's got a COVID crisis that's spiraling out of control. He's got plummeting approval ratings. ratings, you know, even as high as 90% in the immediate aftermath of the sanctions in 2014. And I've seen some polls suggesting he's closer to 50 now. And so his kind of space for causing havoc overseas is less than it used to be. And so I think the real question is what happens after the election, because presumably Russia won't be as opportunistic in the next several months into the next year. And then if it's President Trump, does he ratchet things up again when things stabilize for him a little bit in the country, assuming they do? And if it's President Biden, how does a Biden administration work with Congress here in the United States on trying to impose a deterrent effect on Russia, whether that's the use of sanctions or other measures?